we're in Daniel 2. Please don't go there. I'll just review very quickly, and I have lots of notes, which I have conditioned myself to read off of today. Unlike most times where I prepare notes and it's whoop, and off we go. All right, Daniel 2, we saw King Nebuchadnezzar's dream and interpretation. Daniel was the only one who could tell the king about his dream and his interpretation. The whole picture that I drew for you, the head of gold representing Nebuchadnezzar and the kingdom of Babylon. The arms and shoulders of silver representing the Medo-Persian Empire. Belly and sides of brass representing the Grecian Empire. Historically, Alexander the Great, which I keep referring to because he's an important part of this whole building block. The legs of iron representing the Roman Empire. And then we've got this gap right down to the toes, which are part clay and part iron. In the next passage, we have the visions of the beastly kingdoms. And that, again, is out of Daniel. The lion symbolizing Babylon, the bear Medo-Persia, the leopard Greece, and the nondescript beast, the Roman Empire. And out of that beast, the 10 horns, and from there, one little horn. That's out of Daniel 7. And each one of these keeps leading us from a big picture, slightly more narrower, to a final place, which we will arrive at chapter 11 today. But this nondescript beast that has 10 horns, and out of that, one little horn comes, and the little horn is always referencing the Antichrist, that same power that will crop up. So we know the 10 toes and the 10 horns are representing a loose confederacy of the old Roman Empire, and that is, we'll be looking at that more closely when we get into the book of Revelation and we begin to look at last days events with greater detail. But then we go to chapter 8 in Daniel. The ram that symbolizes the Medo-Persian Empire that is conquered by Babylon has power, and then all of a sudden it is powerless. And then there is a he-goat that is moving very fast and with great force. It appears his feet don't touch the ground. Again, that brings us back to Alexander the Great and his conquering. By the time you read in Daniel 8 and I believe 9, the he-goat waxed very great, 8:8, and then 8:9, out of one of them came forth a little horn. So don't think, as some people have made a mistake to think each chapter represents something different. In these chapters, we've seen the big picture, and then it's getting, 4 kingdoms, then it's a little more narrow, and now we're down to 2 kingdoms here, the ram and the he-goat, which then comes back down to what comes out of that one territory, out of the he-goat, which is a little horn, which again brings us back to Antichrist. So now, from the 8th chapter, I'm not going to touch the 9th or the 10th chapter today. We're going to jump into the 11th chapter. And the 11th chapter requires great detail. And we move from images and beasts. Now it's focused down to 2 kingdoms, Egypt and Syria. And this is very important because a lot of people will read this. You get one group of people who are the historicists who will tell you, oh, this has already all happened. And much of this chapter is historical. That's why I said this is going to be a lot of work for me today because I have to consult my notes. There's so many details. And you might say, well, how did Daniel, writing some couple hundred years before these events, how could he have known? And there's one factor in here that makes it super, super important to understand. How could he have known is the prophecy that God gave him. But the most important thing is between what will be referred to, and I'll repeat it as I go so it's clear. The king of the south in the 11th chapter, which is referencing Egypt for right now, and the king of the north, which is representing Syria. What is in between Egypt and Syria? Thank you. That is the whole deal. I will teach on the 70 weeks of years. I'm going to teach this whole book and lay the whole foundation. But the one thing, if somebody misses this, between these 2 warring kings is the territory that will be essentially the tug of war. Who can take it? Who can control it? And remember the whole prophecy out of One of the chapters, I believe it's in the 9th chapter, the 70 weeks of years are determined upon thy people, referring to the Jews and referring to the place. So it's very important to understand this is not some geography lesson. I would tell you, until we get into the 40th verse of the 11th chapter, you can be very sure that the north and the south here are constant. What is a problem? I'm going to tell you what is a problem. Many people have given their interpretations, and unfortunately, some of the things, when you read them, if you know history, and you know how much I love history, I'm a history nut, they don't necessarily line up. And then there are things that you say, well, that's definitely that individual in history that people just overlooked. So I'm going to try to not kill you with the details, okay? But let's see what happens here. So I'm starting in the 2nd verse of the 11th chapter. We'll come back to the chapters we've jumped over. Remember, think the big picture that has now been focused down. No more images, no more beasts. We're talking kings and territories. Why is this important? At the death of Alexander the Great, his kingdom broke into 4. We'll read that in the verses coming up. His kingdom essentially divided into 4 by his 4 generals. They did not have his power. Now, we can't appreciate this because it's history, and many books have been written on Alexander the Great. But if you understand that at age 30, what he accomplished, and he did not do it in the natural. There's just no way. He was a very, I don't want to call him spiritual. He sought after the spiritual things, but it didn't matter what he sought after. He sought after the oracles, after any type of mystical advice and guidance. And it is not just my belief, but it is absolutely clear, particularly in this passage and in some others we've already covered, that what drove him, he might have been a mastermind general, but what drove him, there was a power, a demonic power that drove him. Now, that's not a statement to be cruel, that's a statement of fact, because his generals and his kingdom, as it split and divided into those 4 generals, not one of those had the power that he possessed. And we'll read about in Revelation when John is writing, and it says, describing what was, but is not, and what will be, referring to that same demon power that will be unleashed at a later time. So, and if you don't understand or you don't believe in demons, stick around, because I'm going to do a lot of teaching on the true understanding of demons, those fallen angels, and spiritual warfare beyond what we normally teach, so that people can understand there are forces beyond the regular hierarchy that we talk about. We say we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers. These are a hierarchy of the invisible. People readily embrace angelology or the worship of angels, and they say all angels are good, and they tell their kids, be an angel today. But if you really understood what that meant, you probably would not say that to your kid. Now, Daniel 11, verse 2. And now I will show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia. The 4th shall be far richer than they all. Now we know that we can historically trace the kings, and by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia. That is Xerxes. We know that historically that is Xerxes. Then it says, a mighty king shall stand up, that is, he shall come to power, shall rule with great dominion, and do according to his will. And when he shall stand up, we're now talking about Alexander the Great. This is one of the few chapters that has this much historical detail, so bear with me. When he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken. Essentially, at the height of his power, his kingdom shall be broken, and shall be divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, and not to his posterity. Now, depending on which books you read, some people will say, I've heard people say that Alexander the Great had a half-brother who was mentally retarded. I'm not sure how they defined that in that day. And some other things. From the sources, the ones that are legitimate, I find nowhere that he had a legitimate child. He may have had an illegitimate child. There was a child born after he died, but there was no legitimate child. There was no, therefore, posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others beside those. Here we go. So 4 divided into 4, and the king of the south, let's make sure we know who the king of the south is. That's the king of Egypt. Thank you. If you don't have that written down, write it down. So the next time you read it, it'll be clear. And let me just tell you, if you're not sure, sometimes you think, I don't know about that. I'm not worried that you go check out what I'm saying. I encourage it. And one of the best sources, the Septuagint, which is the Hebrew Bible put into Greek 200 to 300 years before Christ, they were not shy. In most of the places where it says king of the south, they put Egypt. They just didn't mince words. They weren't trying to, go outwardly poetic. They put Egypt. So, all right, so the king of the south shall be strong. We're talking about one of the Ptolemies. This is going to get really, really taxing. I'm going to tell you why. You've got people in the Bible that are historical personages that I'm going to describe, and they all have the same names. So Ptolemies and then second name. And the same thing with the Seleucid. We're only talking about, of the 4, really these are the 2 relevant, the king of Egypt, the king of Syria, Ptolemies of Egypt, so it'll be Ptolemies so-and-so, and Seleucid so-and-so for the most part, until we get to the Antiochus group. But so if you're trying to read history and you go to a history book and you say, but she said this, just recognize that these are the names that would be used as titles to distinguish between these people. So the king of the south shall be strong, one of his princes, and he shall be strong above him, have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. I've always got to consult my notes here because I've got a ton of them. All right. And in the end of years, they shall join themselves together after a lapse of several years, for the king's daughter of the south, that is the Egyptian king's daughter, will enter into an agreement. The daughter of the south will enter into an agreement to marry the king of the north. Now, don't think this is complicated. Even in American history, we had a little bit of that going on. But certainly what was very common in Europe was very common to have marriages of kings and queens, not for the sake of love, but for the sake of gaining territory, gaining favor. So this is no different. So we have here the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. And you do well there to put a little line and point to the margin and write down this name, which is Berenice or Berenike. Now, I need to clear this up because even through this ministry's 40 years of teaching, it's very confusing. There were at least 5 women in a 200-year period who were prominent, who bore the name Berenice or Berenike. The one that we are talking about in this section would have been the daughter of Ptolemies II and Arsinoe, which is a woman. That just has a bad ring to it. Arsinoe II, Arsinoe number 2. Do I know any of you? Because you're just a little bit slow today. All right. Berenice married Antiochus II, who was already married to a woman named Laodice or Laodice. So Antiochus had to put away his first wife, Laodice or Laodice, to get married to Berenice. And of course, that was agreeable because it was all for the sake of gaining property, territory, and favor. Now, it seemed to be a good political move to secure peace after the Second Syrian War. Now, what does this have to do with anything? Well, let me give you the big picture, because the big picture is, this could make a great movie. When Antiochus II died, he didn't assign his son, but he assigned a Seleucus son to be his successor. Berenice tried to instate her son as king and put herself as regent, but that did not work. Laodice, the first wife, the one that got put aside, she comes back and essentially she poisons everybody. That's the ultimate revenge. Nice. Before I leave this, because there'll be one more reference to Berenice in verse 7, but out of a branch of her roots shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come with an army and shall enter into the fortresses of the king of the north, and shall deal against them and shall prevail. Now, what's really important is this is Ptolemy Euergetes the second, successor to Ptolemy's Philadelphus. You don't have to remember these names. But if you should feel inclined to go and look at history, one of the best histories, one of the most reputable, try Britannica or one of those, which does not necessarily have a bias on this. Whoever's writing the history might have an advantage somewhere. Try and find a source that will not have too much stuff going on. So Britannica is one of those sources I would say is always solid. Or I've got a Brill's Polly with me today for another reason, which is a whole series of 20 books of minute detail of things you never wanted to know anyway, right? But so this is Berenice's relative, Euergetes, who now comes and essentially he takes revenge. So let me read that again. But out of a branch out of her roots, that's referring to Berenice. She's dead. She and a lot of her family immediately are dead. But one shall stand up in his estate, which shall come with an army. And he did. He came with an army, ravaging the kingdom of the Seleucids and carried off a vast amount of silver, which is recorded in the history books as one of the greatest pilfering acts of that day. And then it says, and shall deal against them and shall prevail. So obviously he was successful. And shall also carry captives into Egypt their gods with their princes. Very important that you put a little footnote here. Remember, this is a chapter that is written originally in Hebrew, not in Aramaic. And that word for princes, it's a kind of strange word. It can also be idols or molten images. So when it says, they shall also carry captives into Egypt their gods with their princes, I prefer the reading to be molten images or idols, and their precious vessels of silver and of gold. And he shall continue more years than the king of the north. And he did, taking all of that loot with him. And if you read historically, he outlived the king of the north. And when it goes, each time you read the king of the south, we may be dealing with a different king because this is moving through history. So just be mindful, it's not the same king, but it's the same kingdom. Claro? Good, okay. And I will not do the rest of this message in Spanish because then you're all going to leave. All right. So the king of the south shall come into his kingdom and shall return into his own land. This is a very bad translation, my friends. I wish I could tell you that they would make this clear, but I have a note here. It'd be better, because this implication says the king of the south returns to his own land, but it would be better to say that he, so the king of the south shall come into his kingdom. See the italics? Shall return into his own land. Be better to say the he, Seleucus Callinicus, returned an attack on Egypt. Seleucus was terribly defeated and forced to return into his own land. So the detail of this, probably not that important, but if you're looking at history, you would find this in history. He went back to his own land. But his sons, pay attention to this one thing, his sons, plural, shall be stirred up and shall assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overflow and pass through. Then shall he return and be stirred up even to his fortress. Now I want you to notice something. It starts with a plural. This is Seleucus Callinicus attack on Egypt, which was a flop, but it says his sons, plural. But the verse ends with a singular. Then shall he return. Why? Because one of his sons died in battle. If you were reading this, you'd just say, hey, these people can they get this straight? Multiple, plural, or singular? But there's a reason that's done this way, because it starts off his sons, but one of his sons died in battle, so it goes down to a singular. All right, let's keep reading on here. So, the king of the south, let's take a pulse for a minute. King of the south is? Egypt, thank you. I'm going to den that in, so when you read this again, you're going to be clear. King of the south, till you get to the 40th verse. That changes the dynamics, but right now it's all Egypt. King of the south, Egypt, one of the Ptolemies, shall be moved with choler and shall come forth and fight with him, even with the king of the north. That's representing Syria. Thank you. All right. And shall set forth a great multitude, and the multitude shall be given into his hand. Now we're talking about, I said Ptolemies. We're now talking, though, about Antioch. Antiochus III the Great, who restored Syria as far as Gaza. Not an important detail, except what battle, every time they go back and forth, what piece of territory is being tread and being possessed and being taken and then given over and then taken back and then given over. Right there in the middle, Israel. And remember, when we get to the 70 weeks, upon thy people and upon the place, referring to Israel, that land, specifically the city, Jerusalem proper. I talked with somebody a couple of weeks ago, and they said, who cares about Jerusalem, and who cares about Israel? And I said, well, if you're a Christian, you probably should care. I mean, historically, it's a beautiful place. If you've ever been there, it's something, if you haven't been there, you should go, or at least go on the virtual tours. They have them online. They're really great, where, you know, you can pan, you can look around if you've never been there. But if you're interested in eschatology, this little swath of land is where it's all going to happen. It's all going to be, all eyes will be focused there. So just, you know, it shouldn't matter. If you don't care, then that's fine. All right. And when he hath taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up, and he shall cast down many 10,000s, but he shall not be strengthened by it. Let me go back, because I've missed two things in here. One of them, if you want to put a note, verses 11 and 12 have to do with the Battle of Raphia, which is just on the edge of Palestine. But above and beyond that, you can see this is all the telling of back and forth and back and forth. The king of the north shall return, shall set forth a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after certain years with a great army and with much riches. And in those times there shall stand up many against the king of the south. This is what's so amazing. Also the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fall. Let's talk about this robbers of the people, because that's another one of these King James things. We're going, hey, what is that? It should read, to make it clear, remember, we're talking about English coming from a Semitic language, which is already difficult, and then how do you explain what this means without great detail? But it should be understood as people who violate the law, or law and order, or violate justice. The expression could also connote men of violence. And why is that? Because a large number of Jews had aligned themselves with Antiochus the Great, the Third the Great, who was attacking the Egyptian general Scopas. And basically, these people, they traded their allegiance to their people to follow him. So when it says robbers of thy people, essentially people who were breaking the law, and we're talking about, it doesn't explicitly say it, but it'll say it later, the law of God, which is referred to many times here as the covenant in Daniel. What else can I tell you? The victory resulted in Syrian occupation of Palestine as far as Gaza. So what did I tell you? It's like, they have it? No, they don't. They have it? No, I'm taking it back. No, I'm taking it back. And who's in the middle, and who's getting possessed and dispossessed and pilfered and looted? And, well, it's right there. You know, that's why I said this is all about territory. And it's painting a picture. We've now passed probably at least 100 or 150 years. We're now moving into Antiochus III the Great could have been second to Alexander the Great in his conquering ability. Could have. Although he didn't have Alexander's power. He could have been great. But I'll tell you what messed him up. He got greedy. He wanted to take Greece. He set his eyes on Greece and he said, I want that. I want to take that. And he got his butt kicked there. And he never recovered from that. Yes, that was history by Melissa Scott. So the king of the north shall come up and cast up a mount, take the most fenced cities, and the arms of the south shall not withstand. neither his chosen people, neither shall there be any strength to withstand. But he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall be able to stand before him. That is, by the way, king of the north. We're talking about Antiochus III the Great in this passage. And he shall stand in the glorious land, which is another way of referring to that holy land, which by his hand shall be consumed. We're not talking about the city of Jerusalem proper, but the territory, this back and forth. He shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him. Thus shall he do, and shall he give him the daughter of women. And this, I'll have to stop here and explain why I'm going to spend the time to explain this. Corrupting her. So let's stop for a second. Let me backtrack just a few verses, as I've already gone straight over my notes. So when I get busy, carried away talking, okay, I should just toss out the notes. Whoever gets them, good. All right. Let's talk about this, because I told you I've got super notes here. Let me go back to the arms of the south shall not withstand. That's back in verse 15. The arms of the south shall not withstand. This was an attempt by 3 Egyptian leaders, Urupaz, Menecles, and Deamonus, to come to the help of Scopas, but they were unsuccessful. Again, now let's talk about this daughter of women. This is referring to Cleopatra, daughter of women. But which one? How many think there's more than one Cleopatra? How many think there's more than 3? How many think there's more than 5? What if I told you there were 7 women that we're talking about historical prominent. There were 7 women who bore the name Cleopatra, all right? And I brought this. This is Brill's Encyclopedia of the Ancient World, the New Poly. And here under the category, because I thought, some of you are, you're like me. You won't believe it until you see it. A little hard-headed. But, and this is what's difficult, because I need you to do some homework. You could take my word. I could read you about all 7, but I need you to do a little bit of homework and do some computations. Antiochus III the Great lived at a particular time, and it says in the verse we're looking at, it says, "Thus shall he do, and shall he give him the daughter of women, corrupting her." That particular Cleopatra, and remember I said we're talking about Antiochus III. Cleopatra, daughter of Antiochus III, wife of Ptolemy number 5, the betrothal was decided in the summer of 196. So I'm trying to lead you to see something. It can't be the Cleopatra of Mark Antony Cleopatra. That's way too late. And it gives you the history of who the father was, who is the father of the king that we're talking about now. So, but I encourage you, those of you who are hard-headed or, you grapple and complain about everything I say, go check it out. In the timeline, you will find that this is the one. And why is this important? There's something else I want to highlight about Cleopatra, which she was called, in Alexandria, Cleopatra was called Syria, the Syrian woman. And this is another way you know that we're talking about this is the right Cleopatra, not the one later on. You like historical movies or something, not Elizabeth Taylor's character, okay? There's also something else I want to point out. We're going to talk about a person who most people have heard of, Antiochus Epiphanes. And I think a lot of people think that Antiochus Epiphanes, who comes later, they think, well, he chose that name because that name essentially was the deification of self. But in fact, that was a common thing to Ptolemy and Cleopatra. This particular one we're talking about were worshipped as Theoi Epiphanius, or as gods, epiphany of gods. So it's important to understand these names, they repeat. Cleopatra is repeated, Berenice is repeated, Laodice. It's like, could you not find another name? Think of all, it's kind of like the Roman Catholic Church. If you think of all the popes, right, like Sixtus the Sixth, Sixtus the Seventh, right? Like, can you come up with another name? But that's exactly, we really like this name here, so we're keeping it. All right. Think I will name my child, and it's exactly my name, and it's her name, and it's your name, and everybody has the same name. All right. So enough of that right now. So we're clear that this verse 17, and I've always said, go check me out. I've given you the historical pieces to hang this on. We could spend all morning talking about the historical minutia. If you feel inclined to do that, you go dig. I'm giving you the outline so you can fill in the frame. When it says corrupting her, this is kind of an interesting way of saying that he tried to make this allegiance a political one, and it backfired because it says she shall not stand on his side. She did not side with her dad. She sided with her husband. He was betting on the fact that she would be the pawn in the political game, and she would be obedient to dad, but she turned out to be obedient to her husband, who was on the other side. Remember, it's two countries married together, right? Oh, boy. All right, neither be for him. So she turned against him. After this shall he turn his face unto the isles, and I just referenced this. That's when he decided he was going to go for Greece. He was going to take Greece, and something happens here. It says, and shall take many, and I highlighted in here, but a prince for his own behalf shall cause the reproach offered by him to cease. And I probably need to explain that. This refers to a Roman consul by the name of Asiaticus. It is this man that brings down Antiochus III the Great. I told you it's a message like none other. Like, how can you remember all this? I can't. That's why I have to write it down. And I'm not expecting you to remember, but I'm wanting you to know this whole chapter is pointing to something. It's not only telling us God gave this incredible insight hundreds of years before the events, their prophecy now fulfilled in the past. If God made these things come to pass with such precision, then the things that are yet to happen, we can be very, very, very confident that God will make them come to pass the same way. And that's the whole point of prophecy. Prophecy is not a crystal ball that you go, okay, I can see. But rather, if God made good on all of this, he will make good on the rest of the matter. And I can have great confidence and trust him because he's not a man to lie and he doesn't change his mind and go back on his word, unlike some of us. All right, so here we go. Let me go back to my text. It says, a prince for his own behalf shall cause the reproach offered by him to cease. Without his own reproach, he shall cause it to turn upon him. And then he shall turn his face toward the fort of his own land. So let me talk about this real quickly. He essentially got defeated. If the story is true, this Roman Asiaticus basically drew a circle around him and said, you've got 5 minutes to decide whether you want to walk out here and go back home or be sent home in a body bag. And I think he chose to go his own way. He went into his own land. But he shall be found and fall and not be found. What that means, Antiochus went home. He was broke. He was broken in spirit. He decided to plunder the temple, and that failed. Basically, it's over. He was killed while trying to plunder the temple, and that kind of puts his story to bed. Verse 20, then shall stand up in his estate a raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdom. That is Seleucus Philopator, who, by the way, another one of these who usurped or who took power. And what's so important about this particular person is Rome had imposed a heavy, heavy tariff on all people. This man decided where he could get extra money was from imposing extra tariffs on the Jews. And man, if you talk about being hated for taxation, this was that. It says, but within a few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle. Nope, that's because he was assassinated. That takes care of that, right? Now, I need to explain something. From verse 21 to about verse 30, we'll call it 35a, there is a historical personage being described, and there is also types of Antichrist. So when I first kind of gave you an overview, I gave certain overview statements, but now I'm going to give you the details, and it's really required that we kind of get a handle on this, because these events, that's why I brought my Apocrypha to share with you. These events that are being chronicled from 21 forward have to do with the person of Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, there are Bible commentators and people who have made their living saying everything was fulfilled in the past. It's all about Antiochus Epiphanes. No, that's not correct. From verse 21 forward, we're going to read about this person who historically we can trace until a certain point, about the beginning, second part of the 35th verse of the 11th chapter, where it switches. But I don't want you to get confused either. This person, although he's historic, he displayed all of the characteristics of the person who we will come to know a little bit later in the last verses as Antichrist. So just kind of hold that thought. Just like many people we've encountered, like Alexander the Great, he was possessed by a demon, but he didn't have the necessary characteristics. This man will show the characteristics of what at a future time will be. So let's get into this. And in his estate shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Now, Antiochus Epiphanes he did not take the throne legally. He seized it. But the way he seized it, this is why this verse is it's kind of mind-boggling. He shall come in peaceably, obtain the kingdom by flatteries. He comes in and he basically convinces, he puts his support behind one leader, convinces everybody that leader is the one to support. Then he basically assassinates him and says, gosh, there's nobody to do the job. Okay, I'm it. That's pretty much what he did. I'm giving you the short version here. So when we talk about in verse 21, where it says, to whom they shall not give honor of the kingdom, that is referring to the seizing, as I said, of the throne. He didn't obtain it by succession or appointment. He took it. And then when it says, he shall come in peaceably, obtain the kingdom by flatteries. This is one of the examples of corruption, but there's a whole historical web of intrigue that's meshed around this. And with the arms of a flood, be careful, this is not talking about water. The arms of a flood is talking about military power. With the arms of a flood, they shall be overflown from before him and shall be broken. The arms of a flood has to do with military oppression. And there were several successful military campaigns against Egypt. When Antiochus learned that the Egyptian forces were about to launch a full-out attack, he invaded Egypt himself. It's kind of interesting. Who is this Prince of the Covenant? Scripture, the Book of Maccabees. If you're wanting to do some extra reading to back up all this stuff, Book of Maccabees tells about this Prince of the Covenant, which is referring to the high priest, Onias at the time, who conveniently Antiochus Epiphanes had murdered. So when it says, yea, also the Prince of the Covenant, we're talking about the high priest. He represented the covenant, the high priest. So always a careful thing. And after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully, for he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. Everything has to do, remember, historically with Egypt, Israel, the league. This is the power play between two Ptolemies, Ptolemy Philometor and Ptolemy Euergetes, later generations, who wanted control of Egypt. Again, he shall enter peaceably, even upon the fattest places of the province. That should be understood as he will enter in a time of peace. He entered in when they were not warring. He entered in when no one was expecting it. That's what that means. It's a lot of interpretation here. That's why I said it's very frustrating, because how do you get all this in? And there's a bigger, more important meaning than all these historical details. But that's why I said I'm not reviewing this. We have come to this place already. Let us journey on thither. Yes? All right. Okay. Shall enter peaceably even upon the fattest places of the province. He shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter among them the prey and spoil and riches. Let me stop there. That is indeed the picture of socialism, scattering the riches. But I want to make something clear, because this will be also the hallmark of Antichrist. We talk about Antichrist, we should put a mental note that he will be a man of materialistic eye, and in that materialism, socialism will also be present at the first to make it look like he is the distributor, the Robin Hood, the good. That's how people will be deceived at the first. Because remember, Revelation 6 paints him as a man of peace first, right? Comes peaceably. So how do you make peace with people? You offer an olive branch, right? Or you give them something free. Nobody hates Santa Claus, right? Okay, never mind. That was gratuitous. All right. I think I just need to leave that one alone. All right. Let's continue on here. So he shall forecast his devices against strongholds, even for a time. And he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south. We're still talking about Egypt, king of the south, with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army, but shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him. And probably this is very clear. Egypt was defeated. If you can just put an N there, that you can find this somewhere in the history books. Defeated. Yea, they that feed of the portion of his meat shall destroy him. The people, the subjects of Egypt, turned on their king and supported the attacker. They went with the opposition. So that's what that means. They that feed of the portion of his meat shall destroy him, and his army shall overflow. They added to his already big army, and many shall fall down slain. Both these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief, and they shall speak lies at one table. Wasn't that what happens today with politicians? But what this is speaking about, by the way, and this is very interesting, speak lies at one table. It's the details of two kings sitting down to discuss peace, and neither one has the intent to keep the peace, and they both speak lies, saying, "Oh, sure, it's just like today. Oh, sure, we'll do that. We'll make that work. We can do that, right? But it shall not prosper, for yet the end shall be at the appointed time." And what that means, if you're interested, at the appointed time, when God decides, which God had not yet pulled the trigger. So while the prophet is giving us this great detail, intermittently you're going to find him pulling back with a detail about God, and right here is one of them. For yet the end shall be at the appointed time. It's not ready yet. Then shall he return into his land with great riches. His heart shall be against the holy covenant. See, when Antiochus Epiphanes began to return to his land, he began to have immense hatred of the Jewish people. And that, you can read that whole treatment of his hatred of the Jews in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. And it's documented there. Let me keep reading, and then I'll read. I've got a few things noted here in my... Yes, I brought this big Bible to read something out of. Yes, at the appointed time, he shall return and come toward the south, but it shall not be as the former, nor as the latter. Antiochus basically, at this point, it's like a fading rose. He will never get his glory again. And I think the only thing that's kind of interesting is we start to see a decay or a decline of his kingdom. Let me read out of 1st Maccabees. It's just very brief. It'll give you an idea. 1st Maccabees. Don't try and look for it unless you have a Bible like this one, which I don't think anybody would be crazy enough to tote around, although I did entertain the thought briefly of using this as my regular Bible, and then I said, no. 2nd Maccabees, it's 1st Maccabees, chapter 2, and verse 18. Now therefore come thou first. This is when the king decides he will not let, Antiochus Epiphanes will not let the Jewish people worship anymore as they were. In fact, forgive me, I will read 2 more verses and then I'll read this so it'll make sense to you. For the ships of Shittim shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return, have indignation against the holy covenant. That's against the Jews. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence, remember this is our Hebrew word, being, have understanding with them that forsake the holy covenant. He'll be kind to those people who leave the way of their fathers, right? An arm shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, take away the daily sacrifice, they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. Let me stop there for a minute. It was decreed, now therefore come thou first, and fulfill the king's commandment, like as all the heathen have done, yea, and the men of Judah also, and such as remain at Jerusalem. So shalt thou and thy house be in the number of the king's friends, and thou and thy children shall be honored with silver and gold and many rewards. Essentially, if you'll do what the king bids, you'll be rewarded. That is, stop honoring God's temple, stop doing. And Antiochus Epiphanes took it a step further. He paraded naked people in and outside of the temple to make a spectacle. It was a shame for those people who practiced the religion of their fathers, the Jews, and began to put statues and things to worship and venerate inside the temple, and then basically told some of the priests that instead of offering the sacrifices as they did, that they would give them pig's flesh, and they would eat of the pig's flesh, which was forbidden in Judaism, considered an unclean animal. So there's a whole history that's laid out in the book of 1st and 2nd Maccabees regarding this event, which we're reading about in Daniel. Let me say a footnote here, because it's like time's clicking away and my time's going to be done. I'm like, but let me just say this to you. When people talk about the apocryphal literature, please don't do the thing that I've heard people do so often, which is they throw it out. It's through these books that we get a clearer picture of many of the things that are canonized books, accepted canonized books that we use, that all churches professing to be Christians use. So that's just a sidebar. It's very fascinating reading. But I just read you one passage, and I've kind of marked off several of these. There's such detailing here, by the way, of the man who collected taxes, whose name is Heliodorus, and he's named in this 2nd Maccabees 6th chapter. You find all of these references that are essentially nestled into the 11th chapter of Daniel. So if you're interested, knock yourself out. All right. Let me get back to my text here. So, he shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, shall take away the daily sacrifice, they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. Now, bear with me for a minute, because I'm going to plant something that I'll have to deal with later, not to be confused with. And some of my Hebrew students who study Hebrew, you can look this up for yourself, but verse 31 of the 11th chapter does not read the same as the 12th chapter and 11th verse, and from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away and the abomination that maketh desolate set up. That's future time, not yet happened. The event we're talking about in the 11th chapter, past and already happened. So we'll get to that, but that's the language part of my brain that says, I got to make sure you understand, because some people say, well, is this all past? This part is past, and we're dealing then with something that will happen in the future. And remember, we're dealing with a type, a person who's historical, but he also represents a type of someone who's yet to come. All right. And such, verse 32, and such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries, but the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. The bottom line is the people who know their God will resist. They will not succumb. Now let me ask you a question. How do you know God? How do you get to know God? You spend time in His Word. And Jesus in John 17, I've repeated this many weeks, this is life eternal, that they may know Thee, the one true living God, and Jesus Christ, His Son, whom He hath sent. And the only way to know Jesus Christ is to read His Word. Read the whole book. Don't go, oh, I got to read the whole thing. But that's why you study along with me, and it should inspire you to dig more. You know, other churches, they'd already be asleep. You'd have 10 people knocked off already. I'd be looking at their tonsils, maybe deciding if they need a tonsillectomy back there. Not you. Not you. Besides, most of the folks here don't have tonsils anymore. And they that understand among the people shall instruct many, yet they shall fall by the sword, and by flame, and by captivity, and by spoil, many days. And this verse 34, another one of these anomalies, but when they shall fall, they shall be holpen, that's Old English for helped, with a little help. But many shall cleave to them with flatteries. And verse 34 summarizes a lot about the Maccabean period. Now when they shall fall, they shall be helped with a little help, but many shall cleave to them with flatteries. And some of them of understanding shall fall, to try them, to purge them, to make them white, and to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. So that's your transition point right here. Verse 35 switches the gear from history into prophecy. And you'll find this with all the prophets. Ezekiel did the same thing. Zechariah did the same thing. The prophet is talking and looking far into the future. As I said, Isaiah saw far into the future when he saw the new Jerusalem, looking far, far, far in the distance. And then all of a sudden he's back there and he's talking to a king in his own time, and then we're carried off away. Same thing is happening right here. But we've now shifted gears, and we're now talking about a future time. And the king shall do according to his will. He shall exalt himself, magnify himself above every god, shall speak marvelous things against the God of God, shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished. And this is 2 Thessalonians, till the man of lawlessness, King James, man of sin, be revealed. Here he is. How do I know that? Till the indignation be accomplished, until the wrath of God be poured out. For that is determined, shall be done. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers. This has perplexed many Bible commentators. I don't have time to get into the detail, except to bring you to a point of one thing. We have to deal with this at some point. We're now talking about the person of Antichrist. No regard for the God of his fathers, nor for the desire of women. The main staple of this is nor regard any God. That, you should underline that. Many people are focused on the first two things, but this is the most important. Nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself above all. Somewhere back there in Isaiah, somewhere back there in Ezekiel, we looked at the spirit of Lucifer. I shall be above. I shall ascend. Here it is. He shall magnify himself above all. But in his estate shall be honored the God of forces, the God of munitions. Funny, not the God of musicians. The God of munitions. And a God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor with gold, silver, precious stones, pleasant things. Remember I talked to you about the image of Nebuchadnezzar and the people not bowing down who would succumb? If they didn't, they suffered or they were punished, except for the children that would not. And they were spared, by the way. Here's the same type of thing. Thus shall he do in the most strongholds with a strange God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for gain. Now this verse 40, now changes. There's something that's changing. We're still in the end times future, but at the end of the time shall the king of the south push at him. This is how you know we're no longer dealing with Egypt. We're no longer dealing with Syria. Because remember, Antichrist will come out of that area, which is Iran, Iraq, Syria, portions of Turkey, and we're having the king of the south and the king of the north come at this person. All right? Antichrist. So we're no longer talking about Egypt and Syria. I told you, verse 40 moves to something else, which if I had time, which I don't, because some of you are holding your kidneys very tight, but if I had time, I would take you somewhere else and introduce something, but I don't. So you'll have to, this part will be to be continued. But we're talking about a battle that will take place, that will be an incredible battle, like nothing that's ever been seen. And I'm going to fast forward to bring this to an end, because you've got a number of factors coming against the person of Antichrist. And I'm going to read verse 45. And he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. What does that mean? Turn quickly with me to Revelation 19, and I'll tell you. Sorry for going so long. Hold tight. Almost done. You got no choice, right? All right. Revelation 19, beginning at about verse 11, we have the appearing of the true man on the white horse, Jesus Christ, who appears in this description. And following him were armies upon white horses, clothed in white linen, and out of his mouth a sharp sword, that he should smite the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron. We're talking about the Lord Jesus Christ returning with all of his saints and all of this glory that's happening. We know that it's him, King of kings and Lord of lords. And then, of course, John is writing, and he talks about what's going on. He says, "And I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to make war against him that sat on the horse and against his army." I told you what we just looked at the close of the 11th chapter in Daniel's a great war. Here is a great war taking place, and the beast was taken, and with him the false prophet that wrought miracles before him, with which he deceived them that received the mark of the beast and that worshipped his image. These both were cast alive into a lake of fire burning with brimstone. So when it says at the end of Daniel, and no one will be able to help him, that's because he's going to be tossed into the lake of fire. So it's as if that whole chapter, the whole design of that chapter is to get us to see God is able, right down, we use the expression, God knows the hairs on your head, he's numbered them. God knows right down to the detail of certain things, and he says, this is going to happen. And then when we switch gears and we go into the future, people say, oh, how do you know that? Well, listen, if God gave all of this incredible detail about the past, and it happened, it came to pass, he's told us something else is going to happen. Yes, this person, the man of sin, the man of lawlessness called Antichrist, will rise to power. We know how he'll come to power. We know out of what country or territory he will arise. We have a general idea of the things he will do. But then we recognize that God, who is in control, he says, in my time, yet in my appointed time. In other words, don't you worry about a thing. The things that must be accomplished on earth will be accomplished. I'm going to take care and make sure that that does. The only question that he is still asking today is, when the Son of Man comes again, will he find faith on this earth? And I'm praying that people will be inspired and faith will come by hearing this word, and that with the accuracy that is given in prophecy, we can have the same confidence which should inspire more faith for the things yet to happen. Now, that's my message. I'm Pastor Melissa Scott, pastor of Faith Center, Glendale, California. I teach every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. If you'd like to attend services with us, simply call the 800 number, that is 800-338-3030, to join us. If you'd like to watch, listen, and learn 24 hours a day, simply log on to our website at www.pastormelissascott.com.